Ciao, jewelry makers. I'm Joey Balistreri. Welcome back to our mini series on jewelry tools and supplies for complete beginners. So, today we're going to make some wrapped loops and we're going to be using our round nose pliers that we have already talked about and our two pairs of chain nose pliers, the regular chain nose and the bent chain nose. Now, in the beginning of our series, we talked about eye pins and head pins, and if you'll remember, a head pin just has this flat head on it, which becomes the bead stopper. But head pins are also available in some really fancy, beautiful styles. This one I got from Beadbox Bargains, and it's just a flower, and it has the most detailed center on this flower. And I think this came from one of the craft supply stores. But today we're going to be using some 20 gauge wire to do some wrapped loops and also these ball head pins. So we're going to do a few together. So I have already done one component where I created a bead pattern on a strand of wire and I did a wrapped loop on the top and bottom of this component. And we're going to do some connecting at the end of the wrapping, but I'll show you what the components are and why I decided to do that as we're wrapping. But first I want to just talk to you a little bit about the wire. So this is 20 gauge German style wire and it's round and it is called medium temper and I'm using gold. It's a good medium size wire, not too fragile, not too tough to wire wrap and to work with. So I think it's a really great choice, especially if you're just beginning to practice this. So what I do is cut the top of my package when I buy a spool of wire and I keep it in a Ziploc bag like this. And then I always know what is in here. And then if I have any scraps or the end of another spool, I keep that inside. And so I always know what's in the bag and then I'm not wasting anything because any scraps of wire, if I've cut a length and I don't use all of it, the scraps go in the bag. And it's just the way that I like to do it. You can buy wire on much larger spools and then maybe that wouldn't work for you, but it's just the way that I like to do it and it works for me. So let's begin by doing the same thing that I have already finished here. I'm going to take this piece of 20 gauge wire and I'm just going to run my fingers over it. Now this warms the wire, it straightens it out and just makes it more workable, more pliable and malleable. So just always do that a little bit when I'm beginning to work with wire. Now I'm going to pick up a pair of my chain nose pliers. I like the bent ones, and I'm going to come down a little bit on the wire. I need to leave myself enough space to make a loop and wrap around a few times. So I'm just guesstimating that that's about enough space. So right there, I'm going to take that wire and push it and bend it to a 90-degree angle. So my plier is hanging on to it and it gives me that nice angle. Now I can take that away and put my round nose plier right into that bend that I just made. So on a round nose plier, it is cone shaped. So if you keep your wire closer to the tip of the cone, you will have a smaller loop. If you move the wire down here, you will end up with a much bigger loop. So I usually choose somewhere in here, and that gives me kind of a good size loop, and I try to put my wire in that same place every time when I'm making a piece so that all of my loops will be the same size. Now, I don't have my pliers marked right now, but one trick that will really help you is you can take a Sharpie or a permanent marker and make a little mark on the top and bottom barrel of your round nose pliers so that every time you begin this process of wrapping a loop, you can place those pliers in exactly the same place the wire in exactly the same spot on the pliers, and that will ensure that your loops are all going to be the same size. So I'm not going to do mine today. We're just going to make a couple of loops, but once I have a hold, I have a really good hold on my pliers. I'm closing down tightly on that wire. Now I'm going to take, first I pushed the wire that way. Now I'm going to push it back toward me over the top barrel of those pliers. So if you can see, we have just made a good section of our loop. But now this bottom barrel is in my way. So now I need to rotate or twist that barrel up to the top. So now it is no longer in my way, and now I can really clearly see the loop that I made. And what I'm going to do is take this wire and pull it around the bottom of the barrel toward the back to get a good grip on it, and just pull it toward the back like that. Okay, so I am a visual learner, and so for me, I look at this little loop that we just made. Let me take the plier out so you can see. Look at the loop that we just made as the lady's head. So I'm going to put my pliers back in, and at this point I like to rotate it back and just make sure that that loop is centered on my piece of wire. Now I can remove those pliers and I have the lady's head and her little scarf. So I'm going to come in with my bent chain nose pliers and grab a hold of her head with the pliers facing away so they're not in my way. And now her scarf gets wrapped around her neck. So I will usually start with my finger just to lock it in place, and then pick up my second pair of pliers and grab a hold and very carefully go around right next to the first wrap that I made. And you can go around or make as many wraps as you would like. I generally do 3, but it depends on the piece. If I want more of a wire presence, I may do 4 or 5. If I want it to disappear and not show up so much, I may only wrap around twice. But for the sake of this, I'm going to copy this component that I already did, and I did 3. So let me just bring this to the back, and there's our 3. Now you can remove the plier, and if there's anything wrong with your wraps or your loop, you can take a minute. So I need to complete that wrap. I'm talking and I wasn't paying attention there. Need a 3 on the front and 3 on the back. So now I can cut away, trim away that tail, and it will be a little bit sharp, and once the beads are on, it's much easier to go back and tuck that in. But while there's nothing on the wire, we can take our pliers if we want to and sort of tidy up the loops. We can also do that once the beads are on there, but if a loop got a little misshapen or anything's wrong with it, you do have the opportunity to play with that a little bit. So now we are simply going to string on our beads in the same pattern that we did over here. So I have another one of those crystal faceted barrel beads that we were working with last week, and I have this little flat gold spacer, and I just chose this because I didn't like the flat top of this bead showing in my component that I'm making, so I chose that for that reason. And then I have these faceted rondelle beads. They're half matte black and half gold. I just think they're lovely. And I'm going to stack that on next. And then this is a crystal rondelle spacer. It has crystals encased in a gold frame all the way around. I'm going to feed that on that wire, and then one more of those faceted rondelle beads. So now I'm going to make a loop at the top, and I want to copy as closely as I can this one. So I'm going to hold this loop this way, and my wire needs to get bent in the forward direction. So you can see we bent that one that way. We want to do the same thing again. So once again, I'm going to come in with my one pair of my pliers. You can use your bent chain nose, which I tend to do, but your regular chain nose will work as well, because the width of that plier on the core wire is the space that you are creating for wrapping around it. So these are about the same length, I believe, but I'll do this one because that's what I did on the other end. So I'm going to, again, push that wire in the same direction that I did down here. So once again, push it forward, and we've made a 90-degree angle. Then we remove those pliers, put our round nose pliers in at about the same place that we did on this end, and now we're going to bring that wire over that top barrel. And then to get the plier out of our way, we're going to rotate or twist them up. So now that barrel is on the top, and we'll look at it from this side. We have the beginning of our lady's head. So now we're going to take that wire and, oh, I didn't have a hold of it. You do have to get a hold of it because you're going to be pulling this way, so you have to make sure that with this hand you have a hold of it. So I have it a little wonky, but now you can see that trick will really come in handy where while it's still in the plier on the barrel, we just rotate and straighten it up. And again, if you warm the wire with your fingers a little bit, it will work with you a little bit better. So now we can remove it, and now we have the lady's head and the beginning of her scarf. So I'm going to grab the lady's head with the bent chain nose pliers and just lock it into place with my fingers, and then I'll get those pliers out of the way. Now, if your wire is long enough, if you have a long enough tail, sometimes your leverage feels good to simply do this with your fingers. But if it doesn't, if you don't feel like you have control, you can do it like we did on the other end with another pair of chain nose pliers. So, each one will be different. See what works for you. See what makes you feel like you have the most control, and try it both ways. So now we have our 3 wraps. We filled in that space. We have our 3 wraps. And now we're going to trim away that tail as close as we can to the bead. And when you're doing this, you want to be careful that you don't wrap too tightly or do any damage to the crystal bead, because you absolutely can crack and break and even shatter these beads. So now that we have our beads on our wire, we can go in and tidy everything up if we need to. For sure, we don't want to leave anything sharp. That is really sharp. So I cut it as close as I can, but then I want to gently go in with my pliers and just tuck that tail right into the wraps. And then I want to straighten everything up if it needs it. And then again, like we did on our simple loops, if we need to, we can put our plier back in to center that loop. If they are not going in exactly the same direction, you can put one loop in each plier and straighten it that way, or you can hold one loop and straighten the component with your fingers. But there we have 2 components made with a wrapped loop at the top and at the bottom. So now I'm going to do this bling ball bead on a ball head pin. And I'm just going to put that head pin through the hole, and we're going to do that exact same process where we grab the head pin where it's coming out of the bead, bend it forward, put our round nose pliers inside, get a very good hold of it, bring that wire over the top barrel, rotate that other barrel out of our way, bring it to the back, and now we have the lady's head and the beginning of her scarf. But before we start to do our wraps on this one, we're going to come in here and open this sort of the way we would a jump ring. Just give ourselves a little bit of space, and I want to hang this from the bottom of the other wrapped loop that we made. So I have just strung that right on, and now I can close up that little space that I gave myself, and now I can hold on to that. Let me turn my pliers so that the plier is out of my way. Now I can hold on to that and do my wraps just the way we did on the other one. So in this one, this wire on this ball head pin is really thin, so I am going to do it with pliers because for this one it makes me feel like I have more control. And I am just going to fill in that space. Now, one trick on this head pin is a very fine gauge wire, so I have wrapped down to the bead, and I have some wire left on that head pin, and just to thicken it up, I'm going to wrap back up again. So that is just something that you can do if you have a really fine gauge wire. And then we can trim off anything that's extra and do the exact same thing where we take our chain nose pliers and tuck in any tails or anything that might snag or be sharp or scratch. Just, check it. You can run your finger over your work to make sure. But there we have this beautiful component. And we did the wire wrapping. So let's do one more together. We'll put our ball head pin through this bead and take our bent chain nose pliers, grab a hold of it, bend it forward, put our round nose plier right there, hold on to it, wrap the wire over the top barrel, rotate, bring that around, center it. Now we want to open this little loop that we just made and connect our other component. And I'm going to use my bent chain nose pliers, close that little space up that I gave myself, lock that into place, and then do my wraps. And I'll do the same thing, wrap all the way down to the bead, and because this is such a fine gauge wire on this head pin, I'm going to wrap some of the way up again, and that will give it a little bit of a thicker look. And once you have done that, you can trim off the little tail and tidy it up. Now, I'll just mention one last thing. In today's, I want to make sure that I don't cut the wrong wire. It's ended up a little bit in front of my loop. So one last thing I'll mention is you will hear jewelry makers describe their wraps as a messy wrap, or a neat or perfect wrap. Messy wraps, people use them a lot in boho jewelry and more organic jewelry. And that simply means that you're not just neatly filling in that space from the loop to the bead. It just means that you're sort of randomly letting the wire go around the core. And it's a look, if you like it, it's much easier. You don't really have to pay too much attention to where the wire is landing as you wrap. I tend to not do that so much. I almost have to force myself to do a messy wrap when I'm working. This is a little bit of a messy wrap, and it's okay because this head pin was so thin. This ball head pin was so thin. But there are two ways to do it. So, as you're practicing your wraps, you'll find what works for you. You may be a person that always does messy wraps, and maybe you even like that organic look, but you may be more like me where you like to tidy everything up and you tend to do things more neat, and that's more pleasing to your eye. So that is our little beginner lesson for today, and I thank you so much for being with me. I hope you'll practice this. And again, like I said on the simple loops, I would suggest that you take some beads out and maybe make a beaded chain necklace where you are doing simple loops on both ends and then connecting your next component by another not simple loops, wrapped loops on both ends. And then before you close it, add your next piece of wire in, your next bead, and just do a lot of wrapped loops. Create a long over the head necklace with components, just wrapped loop after, and you will become so good at doing it with that kind of practice. And at the end of your practice, you'll have a beautiful piece that you can wear. Thank you so much for being with me today, and I will see you in the next video.